So I published a response to the biblical scholar Dr. James Tabor's criticism of Paul's use of Genesis in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16. You can click that link and watch that video here. I then produced a longer video explaining the background to Genesis's argument, the plot development of the book, and how careful Paul is being in the way in which he interprets the book in Galatians 3:16. That video is what you're about to watch. I originally produced it for people who I assume are critics, non-believers usually, of Paul's use of the Old Testament. So I thought it would be useful for Christians as well to take a look at this. I'm fully aware that there are places where my translation or my interpretation is offered as if it's the only one, when in fact there's more controversy about these things than you might think. But I wanted to make just a video that was clean and clear and sort of showed how I think we're to understand it. And you can see in the notes some of the references I give to commentaries, and some of which support what I'm saying and some of which give a broader view. So those of you that know better, don't presume that I'm not aware of the technical difficulties of some of these things, and I only present sort of one way to look at it. I respect and think there's merit to some other ways to read these things, so it's not as though I'm being dogmatic about it. But anyway, I think as a Christian it's really good to delve into these things. This is without question Galatians 3:16, the most criticized argument that Paul ever presented from the Old Testament. So I hope you enjoy this. Galatians 3:16 includes the most criticized argument the Apostle Paul ever made. It concerns the beneficiary on the contract guaranteeing God's promise to Abram and to his offspring. Now to Abram were spoken the promises, and to his offspring. It doesn't mean and to offsprings, as if referring to many, but as if referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Messiah. Paul asserts that offspring in this context is not Abram's collection of descendants or his son Isaac. Rather, it's referring to Messiah. The importance of Paul's argument is massive, since his conclusion is that Gentiles in Messiah are counted as heirs of the Abrahamic promises. And if you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. The basis for this interpretation, Paul says, is that the word offspring in Genesis is referring to a singular child of Abraham rather than to a collection of descendants. It doesn't mean and to offsprings as if referring to many, but as if referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Messiah. Many have pointed out that the word offspring is a collective noun and was never written as offsprings, as Paul seems to suggest. Some Christian scholars have tried to blunt this criticism by claiming Paul is using a rabbinical form of figurative argument that may not play well on the modern ear, but was persuasive in Paul's ancient context. But there's a bigger problem, for even if one shows that the word offspring does indeed refer to a singular offspring of Abram, that son is clearly Isaac, as is stated plainly in Genesis. You shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him. Still more odd is that the entire Abrahamic story appears to make no mention of Messiah. So many critics have accused Paul of being embarrassingly wrong on two counts, or at the very least of arguing in ways that no longer hold any weight. It will be easier to address each of these criticisms separately, so let's begin with the question about the singular form of the word offspring. Reading it more closely, it seems clear enough that Paul isn't actually making a grammatical argument, as many suppose, for he is fully aware that the word offspring is a collective noun that isn't written in a plural form to express a plurality of descendants. Look, for example, at Galatians 3:29. You are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. Paul doesn't write you are Abraham's offsprings, heirs according to promise, but offspring, singular, heirs, plural, according to promise. Paul intuitively writes the singular form of offspring while referring to a collection of plural descendants. In addition, Paul knows that the word offspring in a singular form can also describe just one descendant, for he says right in Galatians 3.16, to your offspring, who, singular, is Messiah. Here, offspring is not a collective noun, but a true singular noun, a single offspring of Abram. Therefore, even Galatians on its face demonstrates that Paul knows the word offspring isn't properly written in a plural form to indicate a plurality of descendants, and that a singular form can also refer to just one descendant. Therefore, in Galatians 3.16, Paul is not appealing to the absence of a virtually unused form, offsprings, in the service of a grammatical argument. In fact, he doesn't at any point actually use the Greek terms for a grammatical singular, enikon, or plural, plethindikon. So what is he arguing? He isn't talking about the grammatical form of the word offspring, but about the meaning of the word in Genesis 15, where the covenant is established. As we've already shown, the word offspring is ambiguous, whether it's referring to a single descendant or to a plurality of descendants. So Paul in Galatians 3.16 is clarifying the meaning of the word offspring in Genesis and declaring that the promise of the inheritance was originally to Abram and to a single offspring. This does not, of course, deny that in that single offspring is the plural collection of future offspring, for it also plainly states that this offspring shall become as innumerable as the stars of the night sky, and Paul isn't denying this. The question Paul is concerned with is to whom exactly the original promise was made, and therefore whose name, so to speak, is on the original contract along with Abram's. In other words, where it says to your offspring, who precisely is it referring to? Paul's answer to this question is that the meaning of to your offspring is well established by Genesis itself, in the plain language of the conversation in Genesis 15 that takes place right before the contract is ratified. For there, God explicitly refers to a single offspring of Abram as his direct heir. For God says, this person, that is Abram's servant Eliezer, will not be your heir, but your own son, singular, will be your heir. Or more literally, he, singular, who comes from your loins, will be your heir. The main takeaway then for Paul is that God spoke at times in Genesis very clearly of a single offspring, a natural-born son of Abram, in whom the plurality of Abram's offspring was contained. It's this single offspring who is the named beneficiary in the contract in Genesis 15. No descendant outside of this offspring could be reckoned as an heir. There's nothing controversial then about the plain language of Genesis 15 and of its restatement in Genesis 17. So it's a bit surprising to find so many scholars stumbling over Paul's point. But now we turn to the second problem, which is the bigger one anyway. To briefly restate it, even if we agree with Paul that a single Abrahamic offspring is the primary focus of the covenant ratified in Genesis 15, Isaac must be this single offspring. For when Isaac's birth is announced, God says, I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant. Further, the word Messiah is never used in Genesis anyway. So the question then is, why does Paul state so flatly that Messiah was this unnamed offspring in Genesis 15? Unfortunately, Paul doesn't provide his reasons. Perhaps that's because the weight of his case falls on the very idea of Messiah. For in Galatians 3.16, he doesn't speak of Jesus by name, but only of Messiah. That is, Paul is speaking of the well-known messianic figure, a son of David, described extensively in Scripture and anticipated by many Jews. To Paul, this Messiah is demonstrably Jesus, of course. To Jews more generally, this prophesied Messiah was a part of God's purposes from the beginning. It may be then that this is all that stands behind Paul's assertion. Since Messiah would be the apex of God's program to restore the world, he simply must have been the offspring God had in mind, as Abram's heir in Genesis. But before settling on this explanation, we need to ask whether in the first place it's true after all that this Messiah is not mentioned within Genesis itself, as Paul seems to intimate. Many wrongly assume that since the word Messiah does not appear in Genesis, then no messianic figure could be spoken of. But the term Messiah, or Anointed One, is first used in the book of Samuel in reference to Israel's kings. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed, his Mashiach, or Messiah. The Anointed One, then, means the anointed king. So a better question to ask is whether there are any references within Genesis to an Abrahamic offspring who would become a king. And the simple answer is yes, quite a few references it turns out. For when Isaac's birth is promised, God says to Abram, "Kings will come from you." And later in Genesis 35, God reiterates the same promise to Jacob. And then, toward the end of the book, Jacob announces to his sons that these kings shall descend from the line of Judah. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. The problem is that in all these passages, Abrahamic kings, or anointed ones, messiahs, are referred to in the plural. Is there any discussion of a single king in Genesis? To answer this question, we need to briefly review the overarching theme of the book and its central plot development. In other words, we aren't just looking for some obscure possible reference to the Messiah, but we want to know if there's a clear and substantive reference to such a figure, and how does this figure relate to the book as a whole. We begin by noting that the word offspring, zera in Hebrew, appears vastly more times in Genesis than in any other book of the Hebrew Scriptures. Unsurprisingly, therefore, the first major story of Genesis is the account of how God creates a world to house his own unique offspring. The fathering of humans in God's own likeness is the climactic event of the opening story. The second major story is about how these first humans rebel against God after falling prey to the machinations of a dark mind. This adversary of God embodies itself in a creature whose appearance is deliberately and deceptively inferior to humans. He is crafty in appearance as well as in speech. As a result of their disobedience, God bans humans from the tree of life, for he has previously warned them, "In the day you eat of it, you will surely die." If God's breathing life into his unique offspring is the centerpiece of the book's opening scenes, the catastrophe of their death punctuates the second major story section. In response to this catastrophe, God famously announces to his adversary that a single male offspring will be born to the woman, will talionically crush the head of this dark intelligence, and will thereby revive humanity. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall crush your head, and you shall crush his heel." Hebrew scholars have shown persuasively why the Hebrew in Genesis 3:15 is referring to a single male offspring of the woman, and thus why the Septuagint translates the Hebrew as if this is the case. Because the banishment from the tree of life will prove to be temporary, the woman is named Eve, Chava, which signifies life-giver. The woman through whom the catastrophe of death was triggered will now serve a chief role in reviving humanity, and thus become the mother of all living. God's pronouncement to his adversary plants in the narrative an expectation for a coming champion, who will crush the adversary's head and will revive humanity from death. The remainder of Genesis focuses on two related things. First, it traces the genealogical line leading to this great reviver, and second, it narrates major episodes about giving and preserving life, among his ancestors. These episodes of life-giving and life preservation anticipate the future revivification of humanity. Genesis, in fact, uses the word life far more than any other book of the Pentateuch. In the third major story section of the book, Noah, for example, preserves humanity alive in the ark. These are humans, the narrator reminds us, in whom is the breath of life. And God's post-diluvian instructions to Noah in chapter 9 focus primarily on the sacred value of human life among his own offspring in the new creation. But Noah never personally crushes the head of the old adversary. He is not the great reviver. In the final lines of Noah's story, we find the important announcement that the descendants of Japheth and Ham will dwell in the tents of Shem. That is, the great reviver will descend from the Shemites and will one day rule over all revived humanity. That is, the great reviver will be a king. In the fourth story section, Abram, the distant offspring of Shem, is told that in his offspring all the families of the earth will be blessed. Thus the reviver king's genealogy narrows further. All the families of the earth will be revived and blessed in a son of Abraham. Abraham's entire story, of course, depends on the promise of an offspring and when God will bring this life, the life of the offspring, to Abram. God, in fact, waits 25 years after his promise to actually bring Isaac into the world. But why does God wait so long? For Abraham and Sarah grow old in the meantime. And the answer is clearly so that Abraham has to believe God will give life through their infertile bodies. He has to believe God will bring life from death. This is also why the dramatic climax of Abraham's story is the sacrifice of Isaac, a test whether Abram believes God will resurrect Isaac from the dead to fulfill his promises to him. Neither Abram, Isaac, or Jacob, however, proved to be the reviver king, and it's crucial to our original question that they receive only a sliver of the land God promises in the covenant of Genesis 15. To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. In other words, it becomes clear within Genesis itself that these patriarchs are placeholder heirs, guardians of the promises and of the elect Abrahamic offspring, until the reviver king is born through the tribe of Judah. The final story section focuses considerably on Jacob's son, Joseph. What is his long story about? Well, listen to Joseph himself summarize his story at the end by declaring that his long and difficult journey was orchestrated by God so that many people should be kept alive. Like Noah and Abraham before him, the entire focus of Joseph's story is on the preservation of human life. But in the final lines of the book, Joseph announces he too will soon die. Alas, he is yet another prototype of the reviver king, and not the full reality. The book ends with the expectation of a reviver king never fully realized. It's similar in that sense to how Exodus ends with Israel still well short of the promised land. All the major story sections of Genesis, therefore, are united by their progression toward the coming revival of humanity. The promises, therefore, to Abraham's family about the coming kings signify within the central plot that among them will be found the great reviver king himself. It's entirely irrelevant whether or to what degree the patriarchs themselves understand this overarching program of revival. The narrator's account makes the program's progress crystal clear for the reader. Generations later, according to the book of Samuel, David becomes the first Abrahamic Messiah king of God's own choosing. He grows in strength until he is on the very cusp of ruling for the first time the full scope of the land inheritance mentioned in the covenant of promise in Genesis 15. He has preserved his nation alive by crushing the literal head of Israel's enemy when he defeated Goliath. An Israelite reader of Samuel might have legitimately wondered whether David was the great reviver king promised in Genesis. But God announces to David himself, at the very peak of his power, "I will raise up your offspring after you, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." For the final time, then, the Messiah King's genealogical line is narrowed. In summary, the promise of the Reviver King not only unifies Genesis in its plot development, but also explains why the central theme of the major story sections is about the giving and preservation of life. This theme also accounts for the origin and focus on the qualities of David's unique messianic son, described in the prophets and Psalms. If Paul was a close reader of Genesis, it doesn't seem so surprising that he bluntly states that Messiah was always the primary beneficiary of God's promise to Abraham and to his single offspring. On this reading, we have no need to propose rabbinical figurative arguments. But Paul also found this reading confirmed in real experience by the facts of Jesus' ministry and his victorious encounter with Satan. And of course, Paul famously asserts he encountered the resurrected Messiah on the road to Damascus. In this way, Jesus demonstrated to Paul directly that in his person was located the life-giving power of the Reviver King. But do we have any confirmation that Paul himself actually read God's announcement to the evil serpent as we've suggested? Judge for yourself by listening to the closing words of Romans, Paul's formal treatise on the good news. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. The grace of our Lord Jesus, Messiah, be with you. One doesn't have to believe Paul's conversion account or agree with him about Jesus as the Reviver King to conclude that the Messiah is the preeminent offspring in view throughout Genesis. The expectation throughout the narrative is that a unique champion would be born to revive and rule humanity. Therefore, Paul seems perfectly justified in asserting that Messiah, whoever he be, was all along the primary unnamed beneficiary in the covenant guaranteeing the inheritance, as Jacob himself seems to confirm toward the end of Genesis. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes, to whom it belongs, and to him the obedience of the peoples belongs. It belongs to him precisely because he is the primary heir of the promises. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments section, and I'll try to respond to substantive comments.